Hi, Guy. Welcome TV spoilers. Mariah had thought that if she could just get far enough from Genoa City, if she could drive until the familiar streets and familiar lights disappeared behind her, she might finally cut the cord, tightening around her throat. But the farther she ran, the clearer it became that some things weren't tied to a place. They weren't anchored to a particular road or house or city line. They lived inside her nervous system like a burning inscription that refused to fade. Dominic was asleep in the backseat, small enough to make her afraid that a single blink could somehow make him vanish. Mariah gripped the steering wheel like she was holding onto a vow, trembling while forcing herself to look normal, because if she broke first, everything would collapse. She didn't know where she was going, and she didn't dare name what was chasing her. But the obsession with Ian still seeped into every pause in her breathing. He didn't need to be physically present to control her. He only had to exist as a shadow built from memory, guilt, and the fears she had never been brave enough to admit out loud. In the last few days, Mariah had been living like a puppet on fraying strings. She kept telling herself she was taking Dominic away to protect him, to escape the pressure, to find somewhere quiet enough to hear her own thoughts again. But every time she called it peace, her heart hammered as if it knew she was lying. She looked at Dominic and saw both innocence and an invisible burden one adult had placed on his life before he could even understand what the world was. The harder she tried to keep him out of reach of hands that might hurt him, the more she felt herself slipping beyond the line of reason. And that terrified her most, because Mariah understood what it felt like to be manipulated. She had lived in Ian's darkness once before. She had been twisted and reshaped until she believed pain was proof of being chosen, until she mistook dependence for safety. She had spent too many years clawing her way out of that trap. And now, with one emotional spiral, with one brush against an old wound, Ian's image crawled back out from the deepest part of her, like a monster that never truly died. She didn't want Dominic to be the reason she walked that road again. The worst part was that he had become a mirror she never asked for, reflecting everything she tried to forget. Dominic didn't know it, but his very existence carried a strange power over Mariah, power that could rescue her, or ruin her. He reminded her of the purity she still wanted to believe in, and at the same time he reminded her that evil could reach anything, even the fragile beginning of a new life. Mariah tried not to think too deeply. She tried to focus on the basics: feeding him, soothing him, keeping him safe. But obsession doesn't obey. It waits until you are exhausted, until the night gets quiet and the world thins out, and then it rises like a voice far too close, like a breath against the back of your neck. Everything changed color in the instant Dominic babbled a word: careless, bright, innocent, and precisely because of that, cruel. Papa. The sound slipped out as naturally as air, without hesitation, without intention, without any understanding of consequence. It didn't feel like a child copying an adult for fun. It felt like recognition. And in that moment, Mariah felt the oxygen drain from the room. Her body responded before her mind could explain. Her heart lurched painfully, her hands went cold, her throat turned dry. She spun around to look at Dominic, desperate for a simple explanation. Maybe he'd overheard someone. Maybe he'd said something random. Maybe she'd misheard. But Dominic's gaze made her blood run colder. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking toward a point beyond her, as if his eyes were drawn to someone she didn't want to name. And then Ian appeared in the only way that truly terrified her, not as a victorious puppeteer stepping forward to mock her, but as something dragged unwillingly out of hiding. Mariah was used to an Ian who was controlled, sharp, always certain he had the upper hand. But this time his reaction felt like a nightmare cracking open. He went rigid. His eyes wavered. Panic flashed across his face like a fissure splitting through a mask. It was the fear of someone hearing his real name spoken in public, the fear of someone staring at proof he'd believed was buried forever. Mariah had wondered if she was hallucinating, if her mind was making Ian real. But what kind of hallucination looks afraid in a way that feels this authentic like truth itself is destabilizing it? Ian didn't need to say much for Mariah to understand that something had been triggered. Dominic's papa felt like a key sliding into a rusted lock, and with the smallest twist, the past began to creak and fracture. Dominic wasn't just a child. He was a trace, a connection point, a living detail Ian could not control because it wasn't written on paper or contained in a confession. It was inside a breathing body. Mariah's skin prickled as she realized that the biggest secrets rarely collapse because of documents. They collapse because of something that can't be faked, the involuntary reaction of a guilty man confronted with living evidence. Mariah's mind started to assemble fragments with a dreadful clarity. Dominic carried some genetic marker, some hidden imprint, some unmistakable resemblance or biological clue that Ian recognized or feared others might recognize. Maybe it wasn't even about Dominic being Ian's son in the simplest, literal way. Maybe it was worse. Maybe Dominic was linked to a darker crime, something Ian had done in secret long ago, something that turned birth into a weapon, identity into a commodity. And now Dominic existed. Dominic grew. Dominic breathed. Dominic spoke one innocent word, and everything Ian had convinced himself was safely erased came crawling back to demand to be seen. What wore Mariah down the most wasn't the straightforward idea that Dominic could be Ian's biological child. The true horror lived deeper than that. Ian wasn't terrified because Dominic was his son. He was terrified because Dominic was the proof. Mariah could feel it in the way Ian's presence did not tighten into dominance, but shrank into avoidance. Like a man who knows he is standing in front of something that can destroy everything he has built. Some crimes don't require blood to devastate lives. To tamper with a child's origins, to interfere with the creation of life, to swap, manipulate, and conceal those are crimes that feel cold and filthy at the same time. Mariah's throat tightened as nausea rose in her chest, because if she was even close to right, Dominic had been pulled into Ian's darkness before he had ever opened his eyes. While Mariah stood in that spinning, suffocating truth, somewhere else Abby and Devin were desperately searching for their son. Mariah could feel that desperation like electricity under her skin even from miles away. She could picture Abby's face going pale, the frantic pacing, the useless calls, the helpless rage of being separated from a child. They didn't know Dominic wasn't only missing. They didn't know he was carrying the key to a locked room Ian had sealed for years. And that ignorance made the situation even crueler, because one side was searching in love and terror, while the other side was unraveling in fear of exposure, and Mariah was trapped between those forces, like a person standing between two fires. Mariah's inner war grew brutal, and it played out not in dramatic speeches, but in tiny flashes of thought where she had to ask herself, over and over, whether she was doing the right thing or turning into something unforgivable. She knew Abby and Devin loved Dominic. She knew they were breaking apart without him. Every time Dominic shifted in his sleep, every time he opened his eyes and looked at her, a new blade twisted in Mariah's heart. She was keeping a baby away from his parents. But then the word Papa echoed again in her mind, not as a child's babble, but as a sentence carved into stone. If Ian had interfered in Dominic's life, if Dominic was living proof, then Dominic could be in danger the moment the truth began to surface. And Mariah knew Ian well enough to understand this. A manipulator can pretend to be calm, but a threatened manipulator becomes ruthless. When a man is cornered, he doesn't negotiate with evidence. He destroys it. What horrified Mariah was that Ian was revealing everything without confessing. His fear was a confession that didn't need words. It told her Dominic was the one weakness Ian couldn't fully control. It told her whatever crime lay behind this was so enormous that even Ian couldn't bear to look straight at it. Mariah realized she was standing in front of a truth that could shatter multiple lives, and yet might be the only chance to break Ian's influence forever. But the price of that chance was sickening. She might become the one who forces an entire family to face something they were never prepared to imagine. Hour by hour, Mariah felt as if she were trapped in a room with no exits. She couldn't go back and pretend nothing happened. She couldn't keep running forever, because running forever would turn her into a villain in the eyes of people who loved her. She looked at Dominic and understood he was innocent, but innocence doesn't guarantee safety. Dominic might be a key, and keys make people desperate. They make people want to steal, break, or bury them. Whether Ian was only a haunting presence in Mariah's mind or a real danger closing in from the outside world, he remained a threat because he would never accept being exposed. He would never allow a child to exist as living proof if he believed he had any way to prevent it. In the thick of that fear, Mariah's decision began to take shape not as peaceful certainty, but as a hard, painful resolve. Keeping Dominic was no longer just a panicked impulse. It became a vow: protect the boy from a danger he couldn't yet name, and expose the monstrous secret Ian had hidden for so long. Mariah wasn't doing it because she wanted to be a hero. She was doing it because she could not bear the thought of Dominic growing up inside a lie so massive, inside a manipulation so inhuman, only to be crushed later when the truth detonated in the ugliest possible way. She had learned that truth hurts, but lies poison slowly, quietly, and permanently. And the moment Mariah thought of exposing Ian, she also felt afraid of herself, because she knew she was not stable right now. She was exhausted. She was unraveling. She was haunted. She knew there were dark corners in her mind where Ian had planted things years ago. So her vow was not only against Ian, but against the worst parts of her own desperation. She couldn't allow herself to turn Dominic into a weapon for revenge. She had to remember he was a child, not a tool, not a chess piece. That was the hardest part, because when someone has been hurt for too long, it's easy to confuse justice with relief. Mariah refused to become another version of Ian, even for a second. Abby and Devin were still searching. Mariah knew it as surely as she knew the ache inside her chest. She imagined Abby's shock, Devin's anger, the growing suspicion, and fear spreading outward like cracks in glass. Mariah's eyes burned, and she had to clamp her jaw shut to keep from sobbing. But she also knew this: if she returned Dominic right now, if she let him slip back into the world while this secret remained untouched, Dominic could become a target. He could become the one loose end Ian would feel forced to handle. Mariah could not live with that possibility. She would rather be hated, misunderstood, dragged through judgment, than wake up one day and realize she had delivered Dominic straight into the path of Ian's darkness. When night fell, everything grew quieter, and in that quiet Dominic's papa seemed to hang in the air like a curse. It no longer sounded like a harmless babble. It sounded like the first crack in a sealed vault. Ian's presence still felt shaken, weak in a way that didn't fit the man Mariah remembered, like he was folding in on himself to avoid being seen. And Mariah understood that if she stepped closer to the truth, Ian would strike back, not with seductive whispers this time, but with the cold cruelty of someone backed into a corner. Dominic slept, but Mariah couldn't. She watched his face and felt her heart soften and split at the same time, because she realized she was wagering her entire life on the act of keeping a child safe from a darkness she had nearly drowned in herself. Sometimes Mariah wondered why fate had to be this cruel. Why someone like Ian always found ways to reach into places that should have been sacred. Why a child like Dominic could be pulled into filth before he even learned what family meant. And here, speaking as someone watching and telling this story, I can't pretend I'm completely detached. I feel a very real anger rise up, not only toward Ian, but toward the kind of darkness he represents, the kind that turns blood into currency and turns life into an experiment in control. I also feel a painful sympathy for Mariah, because sometimes people don't do the wrong thing out of evil, but out of fear, because they can't find anything to hold on to except the instinct to protect. But that sympathy only makes one truth sharper. Mariah has to stay awake inside herself. She has to hold on to her humanity, so that when she finally exposes Ian's secret, She doesn't lose herself in the process. Because at this point, Dominic's papa doesn't feel like a random moment anymore. It feels like the first touch on a fracture line. And I can't shake the sense that the secret behind Ian won't open like an ordinary door. It will explode like a room that has been sealed too long, swallowing everyone standing too close, including Mariah and Dominic, clinging to each other like the last piece of driftwood in a storm that still hasn't even been fully named. Mariah could no longer remember exactly when Ian stopped feeling like a memory and started sounding like an order, when his voice became less like an old wound and more like a tightening wire. She only knew that in recent days, every decision she made seemed coated in a strange fog, and inside that fog, Ian always appeared at the exact moment she was weakest. When Dominic shifted in his sleep, when the traffic outside thinned, when the world grew too quiet for her to keep telling herself she was fine, Ian didn't have to touch her. He didn't have to walk into the room in any physical form. He only had to exist as a command lodged inside the cracks of her mind, where fear and love braided together into a rope that was almost impossible to untie. Mariah had once believed she took Dominic away to protect him, to keep him safe from dangers adults often fail to foresee. But the farther she went, the more she realized she was being pulled along a different trajectory, one where protection could be twisted into possession, and kindness could be bent into the perfect excuse to hide a terrible mistake. She hated that she had to face that thought, because it made her feel like a stranger to herself, like someone she had sworn she would never become. Ian in the hallucination, if that was what he was, if reality hadn't already begun to warp, still carried his familiar style. Cold, certain, patient in a way that was almost cruel. He gave Mariah instructions as if everything had already been decided, as if Dominic wasn't a child with breath and a heartbeat, but a holding point in some larger scheme. His orders weren't loud. They didn't need obvious threats. They came wrapped in reason, in suggestions that made Mariah feel like she was choosing, when in fact she was only walking down a path that had been laid out for her. In her mind she heard the soft slicing of his logic. Keep Dominic. Don't go back. Don't trust anyone. Don't let them touch the boy, because they'll take him from you. And then everything you've endured will be meaningless. Every reason sounded correct when filtered through exhaustion and panic. And that was the most terrifying part. Ian didn't manipulate her with nonsense. He manipulated her with arguments that only seemed true when she believed she had no one else to lean on. Day by day, the line between real and unreal grew thinner for Mariah, thin as paper, thin enough to tear with a breath. There were moments she was convinced Ian was truly there in some way that exceeded imagination. There were other moments she was terrified that her mind was collapsing under pressure, that Ian was simply the shape her obsession had chosen to wear. But no matter what he was, the result stayed the same. He made her doubt herself. He made guilt feel like an enemy instead of a warning. And he made her cling to Dominic the way someone clings to the last piece of driftwood in a storm. The more innocent Dominic was, the more Mariah felt she had to do something to deserve that innocence, and Ian exploited that instinct mercilessly. He turned love into a doorway and walked through it like he owned her mind. When Mariah watched Dominic sleep, his face peaceful like an answer she could never find, Ian would whisper that peace only existed because she was doing what he said. And that binding, that false sense of safety, was what exhausted her the most. She wanted to believe she was saving Dominic, but the harder she tried to believe it, the more she felt she was losing herself. Then the moment came, not with an explosion, not with some grand dramatic event, but with a sound so small that in any other context it would have been nothing more than a child's adorable babble. Dominic, while Mariah was spiraling in confusion, suddenly said one word, "Papa." It came out naturally, clearly, without intention, without any understanding of consequence. But for Mariah, it was like a needle piercing the fog she'd been clinging to. She whipped around, her heart clenching painfully, her throat drying as she tried to tell herself it was meaningless sound, and then she felt Ian jolt. Not the jolt of a man angry at being defied, but the jolt of someone yanked out of a hiding place. Ian didn't vanish completely, the way Mariah had feared and some secret part of her had also hoped. Instead, he grew faint, flickering, as if trapped between two worlds. Like an image caught between signals, unable to remain fully in the shadow of hallucination, but not yet able to step fully into the harsh light of reality. That in-between state chilled the air around Mariah, because it felt like something that should not exist, a force still giving orders, but losing its shape. As if the strings had been jerked loose from the manipulator's hands, Mariah stared at that flicker in horror, because she could feel what Dominic's papa had done. It had torn a hole inside her mind. It didn't just weaken Ian. It left Mariah more exposed than she had been in days. As long as Ian remained solid and commanding, even in his toxicity, Mariah still had something to cling to. A voice that decided for her, a pull that spared her from full responsibility. But as Ian blurred, Mariah was forced to face the naked truth. She was the one who had taken Dominic. She was the one keeping him from Abby and Devon. She was the one driving everyone into panic. That truth dropped like a stone into her chest. She found herself wanting Ian to disappear entirely, so she could be free, and at the same time wanting him to snap back into clarity, so she wouldn't have to carry the consequences alone. That contradiction frightened her, because it proved how deeply Ian's influence had rooted itself in her. She had been controlled so long that even the idea of freedom now felt like a kind of terror. Ian's panic spread in a way that made Mariah's spine go cold. He wasn't afraid of losing a conversation. He was afraid of being dragged fully back into reality. He was afraid that Dominic's innocent word might become the hook that pulled him out of the darkness where he was safest. In the shadows, Ian could manipulate Mariah unseen, untouchable, unprovable. But in the light, if he became visible, even for a moment, he could be exposed in front of others, and then his power would no longer be secret. Mariah felt that fear like electricity under her skin. Ian's panic didn't feel performed. It felt instinctive, like the reflex of someone who cannot bear to be seen clearly. And that was when Mariah understood that Papa had struck his pressure point, not as a term of endearment, but as a sign of recognition, a knock on a door Ian had locked for years. The hole in Mariah's mind widened every time Dominic's eyes drifted around the space, as if he were searching for someone. He didn't know what he had done, but that unconsciousness was more brutal than any accusation. Mariah began to experience the boundary between real and unreal as a thin pane of glass cracking. She heard a car pass and couldn't tell if it was ordinary traffic or Abby and Devon drawing closer. She heard Dominic breathing and couldn't tell if it was simply a sleeping child or an alarm that could trigger Ian's next distortion. She looked into empty air and couldn't tell if Ian was there, or if fear had simply taken his shape. Everything became so fragile that one wrong move could shatter it all. And inside that fragility, Mariah felt both a small release and a deeper panic. Ian weakening meant she had a chance to break free. But Ian weakening also meant she would have to answer for everything she had done. Somewhere else, Abby and Devon kept searching for Dominic. Mariah didn't need to see them to feel the pressure approaching like a wave. With every hour, the chance they would almost find her grew. The thought made her breath catch. She pictured Abby knocking at a door, Devon standing behind her, their faces split between terror and fury, and Dominic right here alive, safe, and stolen. What could Mariah possibly say? She could claim Ian was controlling her, but who would believe her if Ian existed only as a hallucination? She could insist she did it to protect Dominic. But if protection means taking a child from his parents, where does rescue end and kidnapping begin? Those questions cut into Mariah until she felt dizzy, making her want to run again and also want to stop immediately. But stopping wasn't automatically safe either, because if Ian truly was being pulled toward reality, if he was being exposed, he would fight back. And Mariah understood the nature of a manipulator. In the shadows, he uses velvet logic. In the light, cornered, he uses survival cruelty. Mariah's inner battle now felt like two hands tearing at her heart. One hand was Ian, his familiar commands, his insistence she keep Dominic, his reasons that wrapped around her panic like silk. The other hand was reality, Abby and Devon searching for their son, Dominic needing his true family, and Mariah carrying responsibility for what she had done. The terrifying thing was that Mariah couldn't completely deny either side. She hated Ian, but she also feared the emptiness his disappearance would leave, because that emptiness would mean standing alone on legs that had been shaking for too long. She loved Abby and Devon, but she also feared that if Dominic was returned right now, the child would walk into the range of a secret she hadn't yet fully understood. She feared that Dominic, through that one word "Papa," had become the factor that could make Ian lose control. And when Ian loses control, he doesn't stop at psychological threats. Mariah didn't dare imagine too far ahead, but her instincts screamed a brutal possibility. If Dominic truly is what could pull Ian into the light or expose him, then Dominic could become a target. And Mariah couldn't bear the thought that she was both the cause of the chaos and perhaps the only person standing between Dominic and danger. Ian kept giving orders, but his voice now carried a faint tremor beneath it, like metal vibrating after a crack has been struck. He tried to maintain authority, tried to force Mariah to believe he still held everything in his hands, but his flickering image betrayed him. Mariah saw the effectiveness of his manipulation weakening, and the sensation both lightened and frightened her. She realized she had been locked so long inside an invisible prison that when the bars finally shook, she didn't know whether to feel hope or dread, because freedom doesn't arrive like a warm reward. Sometimes it arrives like a fall, and in that fall you have to face the consequences you were avoiding. The pressure intensified as Abby and Devon came closer to the truth. One clue, one sighting of Mariah's car, one wrong step, and everything would be dragged into the open. Mariah felt as if her every heartbeat echoed with their approaching footsteps. She began to picture headlines, whispers, judgmental stares. She had been judged in this town before, and she knew Genoa City doesn't offer forgiveness easily, especially when a child is involved. But this time the thing she feared most wasn't public opinion. It was being forced to speak aloud what was happening inside her, to describe Ian, to explain hallucinations, to admit orders while she herself could not fully prove what was real. If she couldn't prove Ian's presence, people would only see Mariah, who ran with Dominic. Her psychological truth would be crushed by the surface truth. That thought made her nauseous, yet she also knew it. There was no way back to silence. Dominic had said "Papa." Ian had weakened. The hole in her mind had opened. From this moment on, every step she took would leave a mark. Mariah looked at Dominic, a child who couldn't know that one word had turned the adult world into a minefield. Dominic didn't know who Ian was, didn't know what hallucination meant, didn't know what it meant to be trapped between two worlds. He only knew how to call out from instinct, and that instinct had struck Ian's pressure point. Mariah felt her heart twist with the injustice of it. Why should a child carry the weight of a war between reality and illusion, between truth and manipulation? She realized Dominic's fate no longer depended only on whether she brought him back or not. It depended on her next decision. Would she obey Ian again and allow him to keep her imprisoned in shadow, or would she face reality and accept the consequences, even if it shattered her before it freed her? And in the very moment Mariah felt herself breaking, she recognized something even colder. If Ian truly was stuck between hallucination and reality, he was in a dangerous state. A manipulator who loses his hiding place becomes reckless. He will do anything to return to shadow or drag others down with him. Mariah understood that in her bones, as if her body remembered Ian's rules more clearly than her mind did. So Ian's weakening was not only an opportunity, it was a warning. If Mariah stepped wrong, she wouldn't just lose Dominic, lose Abby and Devon, lose the town's trust, she could lose herself, because Ian would latch onto any crack to return. And this time he wouldn't be patient. Dominic's papa had shaken him. Ian was panicking. And when Ian panics, he doesn't play subtle games anymore. He claws and yanks and manipulates with whatever he has left. Mariah stood at the edge of a decision that felt like it would determine Dominic's fate and her own future. Keeping Dominic under Ian's command could prolong the control, prolong the running, prolong the state, where she didn't have to fully face what she'd done. But it would also make her a hostage to illusion and turn Dominic into the center of a manipulation that was growing more dangerous by the hour. Letting Dominic go, allowing Abby and Evan to find their son, might be the morally right choice, but it would also open the door to exposure, and if exposure happened, Ian might be dragged fully into reality or revealed, and no one could predict how he would react. Mariah felt as if every option carried a price, and every price would hurt. But in that moment she understood the cruelest truth of all. Refusing to choose is also a choice. Delay is complicity. And if she let Ian keep commanding her, she wouldn't just lose Dominic, she would lose the human part of herself. I have to admit, watching this story reach this point doesn't feel like ordinary soap opera suspense anymore. It feels heavier than that. There is something genuinely painful in seeing Mariah trapped between the instinct to protect and the raw truth that she is also causing harm. There is something truly frightening in the idea that a child as innocent as Dominic can accidentally become the voice that pulls a monster into the light. And there is something in me anger, honestly, not only at Ian as a manipulator, but at the way darkness always finds a way into the places that should be safest. Yet alongside that anger, there is a fragile thread of hope. If Ian is fading, if his power is trembling, then Mariah still has a chance to choose truth, even if truth breaks her before it frees her. And the thought that haunts me most is that Dominic's papa wasn't the ending. It felt like the first knock on a door that has been locked too long, and now that door is beginning to shake. As Abby and Devin draw closer and Mariah is forced to decide, I can't stop thinking that the next moment won't be about getting caught or escaping in time. It will be the moment Ian himself has to choose: vanish completely or become visible enough to drag Mariah down one last time. And if that happens, Dominic's fate will hang on a thread so thin that one wrong breath will snap it. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in The Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about The Young and the Restless series.